Hello and welcome. It's Friday. You're tuned into the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. A little bit later, we have a special guest theater of the mind. Our good friend Jeff Belanger has submitted his story, Alone in the Dark Underworld of the Paris Catacombs. That's today's Theater of the Mind, as retold by Jeff Belanger himself, with the magic of Tim Dennis producing. So that'll be a little bit later on in the show. Today's show I'm really excited about. I know I say that a lot, but in this case I am. Listen, since I was a kid, if you would ask me what one superpower I wish I had, it would have to be flight. I dream and I fly in my dreams. And I'm so conscious of it once I begin that I'm in a dream that I do my best to hold on to those moments in the dream. And I try not to wake up. I try not to let myself become too lucid for fear that it will convolute and change the dream. But there's no better feeling than that moment of flight. So that has been something that's fascinated me through eternity. And there's been yogis that have claimed that they could levitate. And if you remember shows like That's Incredible and Real People from the 70s and 80s, on occasion they would have these yogis on, and their version of levitation would be sitting with their legs folded, and you would see them bumping off their butt into the air, claiming that was a form of levitation. And I was always severely let down. But there was a story that captured my attention, the story of St. Joseph. And today we're going to talk with Michael Grasso, and he is presently an independent scholar, has taught humanities and philosophy at Marymount Manhattan College, City University of New York, and City University of New Jersey. He's actively affiliated with the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia and on the board of directors of the American Philosophical Practitioners Association, and is a past editor of the journal for that association. His book, The Man Who Could Fly, St. Joseph, became famous for frequent levitations, which were observed on hundreds of occasions by thousands of witnesses, including many skeptics. Mr. Grasso is here to talk to us as he delved into this man's history to try to understand and uncover what was going on. And Michael, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm delighted to be here and to talk to you about this.
Now, you've got two books out. The most recent came out in September of this year, Wings of Ecstasy, and we'll have links to both of these books up on our site. So if you go to darknessradio.com, click on the Killer Deals link, it'll take you into our Amazon page. You'll see both books there, Wings of Ecstasy, and the original book, which came out a few years back, The Man Who Could Fly, St. Joseph of, is it Cupertino?
Cupertino, yeah.
Cupertino, and the Mystery of Levitation. What drew your attention to this man's story and in his place in history?
Well, actually, I had a couple of things. Like you, I was always fascinated by flying, and I've had wonderful dreams of flying. But I had come across the name of Joseph of Cupertino. I've read some English articles about him, and I could see that the claims for the evidence were very, very compelling. And then one time I was in Italy, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, and I met an Italian novelist who happened to have an interest in St. Joseph, and very impulsively he gave me a biography published in 1722 in Italy of the saint's life and adventures by Domenico Bernini, who was actually the son of the great sculptor Bernini. And I had that book for a couple of years, and then decided with my colleagues at one of our Esalen annual conferences on the theme of expanding our understanding of the human mind, I suggested that maybe we should get this book translated. And so we hired somebody who became my friend since that time. She did an initial translation of the book, and I thought I was just going to do some commentary, but I ended up writing an entire book on the subject. And then recently, we've published the biography also, where I added some further commentary and said things in the second book that I didn't say in the first book. So that's how it came about. And I should add this in terms of my own background and how I got inspired to explore this theme. I was teaching a course back in the 1980s at the University of in New Jersey, City University in New Jersey. I was teaching a course on human potential, and we were doing all kinds of interesting things, studying about meditation, about shamanism, and about all kinds of extraordinary phenomena. We got into practices, and in the course of the term, we meditated and did various things in class. So one day, a student was telling me about a game that she played, a levitation game when she was a child. It was called Light as a Feather.
Yes.
And I had never heard of this thing.
Yes. I'm so glad you're bringing this up because, Michael, this game, and I've mentioned it on the show, this game is one of the few things, and I've been in some of the most reportedly haunted locations on the planet, and for some reason, this game freaks me out. So I'm ready to hear what you have to say. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, what happened in this is a college class, right? And so unexpectedly I said, okay, let's select 4 of the most young ladies who were the least muscular looking, so we picked, and then we picked this 200-pound ex-Marine, a wonderful student in the class, and I said, so he sat down, and the whole idea of the game is apparently that the children will just touch the person who is to be lifted, and they will sort of chant together or breathe together or do something together and then say lift. Now, the thing is, we had been doing that as adults, meditating and chanting together. So we already had this rapport, and this is why I believe it was successful. I have to say, what I'm about to describe is I only succeeded once, and I believe it was because of this class. We had developed this rapport. So this was an on-the-spot thing, and by the way, we had another professor who was teaching the class, so he was an additional witness. So we had the 4 girls, 2 of them with their fingers just from their hand inverted, so that there's no pulling capacity under the knees, and the other 2 girls sort of touched around the elbows. And so I had them. We did a little chant. The 4 of us, or the small group, as it were, and suggested that we take a couple of deep breaths together. And I, of course, had no idea what was about to happen because I'd never heard of this thing. And here was this huge Marine sitting, squatting in his chair, and I scarcely expected anything to happen. And then I said, lift. Well, I'll be darned, David, but up he went. The 4 young ladies reached as far as they could, and up he went. And I will never forget the look on this man's face of utter amazement and astonishment. And we were all just completely flabbergasted. But he remained in the air, and believe me, they were not pushing. They were just, and even if they were, making every effort with 2 fingers to raise a 200-pound human being, they couldn't have done it.
Now, did you say he was in a seated position?
He was in a seated position.
Interesting.
So up he went. He was off the ground, completely off the ground, as far as they could reach up. I'd say it lasted a few seconds, and then gently and effortlessly he came back down. So an entire class, including 2 professors, witnessed this phenomenon. And we were all quite amazed and thrilled by it. And so I walked out of that classroom with the absolute conviction that levitation was possible. And That was an additional factor. I've done other experiments with levitation, but this was the most spectacular. And having had that impression of the reality of the phenomenon, I couldn't resist then to go on and pursue this research with St. Joseph, and of course many other examples. But the reason I focused on Joseph is because he has a reputation of being the most spectacular case of a mystic and a miracle worker. Not only did he do all kinds of levitation phenomena outdoors, broad daylight, in front of people, for a 35-year career as a priest. From the moment he became a priest, it's almost as though he always had sort of ecstatic experiences, but once he became a priest, it was almost as though he felt he had license to go the whole hog, as it were, and let go, and he would get carried away. It would be involuntary and often very embarrassing, and in the end, it became a problem for his life, and maybe we can talk about that later. But
right. I do want to revisit, though, real quickly here, Sue. Yeah, sure. I'm so glad that in an academic kind of setting, you entertained the idea of this experiment. See, what I did, and this was always something, I remember this well. It was 19, I think, the end part of 85, and I was at a party with a bunch of my friends, and they had been playing with the Ouija board. I watched something weird happen with that I'd never seen. The planchette, literally, as we all stood up and walked away, standing away from the table, the planchette skittered across the board and hit the floor on its own. And that was interesting. Wow. A few moments later, Shannon, who was running the party, said, we should play stiff as a board, light as a feather. And I'm like, what is this? She goes, all right, everybody sit down. So we did it a different way. We all got down on our knees, and we had one of the guys lay down on the floor. And again, we picked one of the biggest guys. And all we did was take our pointer fingers and put them just slightly underneath the person. Right. And then she was kind of our storyteller. And we were all supposed to close our eyes and breathe deeply, and she would walk us through this. And it was basically kind of the story of Stand By Me, how these kids came upon this dead body in the woods. And, first they were entranced by it and blah, blah, blah. So she's weaving this kind of hypnotic suggestion, I'm figuring, as we're doing this. And then she goes, and as the children surrounded, the body, they began chanting, stiff as a board, light as a feather. Stiff as a board, light as a feather. Stiff as a board. And she'd go, and then she says, now stand. And we all began to stand. And I'm peeking out of my eyes. This guy is going up with our fingertips underneath him. Now, mind you, Michael, we had about 9 people doing this. Right. So I start doing what every guy that's helped move a couch does at some point, and I kind of let go to make sure, hey, are they really doing this? Do I have to put this much effort in? Right. And I slowly kind of dip my fingers underneath him, and there's no lag. It's not like he starts to drop. And I look at everybody else, and their fingers, it is literally the fingertips. We raise this kid up to our chest level. His eyes are closed. I'm looking around, and I straight out said, what the is going on? And his eyes open, and as soon as his eyes open, boom, he hits the ground. And okay. We're all standing there, and I go, what was that? And then they were laughing, and they tried to explain it to me. And I've had other people with quote-unquote scientific background tell me, no, it's physics, Dave. You're all positioned around this person, and you don't feel like you're putting enough pressure, but all of you are lifting, and it's just that you're encircling this guy. And I'm like, no, this was barely the tips of our fingers. And this guy was hovering chest level above the ground. And I've had people swear to me, no, it's science. It's just physics. It's lifting. I said, it's physics, but it's not what you're explaining to me. I was there. I witnessed this thing. And I thought I was nuts for all these years, but I'm so glad that either you're just as nuts as I am, or there's something to this story, Michael. That is a very weird deal. So what do you make of that? I mean, how is that even possible that this could take place?
Yeah. Well, the truth of the matter is, it is a mystery. And I have spoken with physicists, and I have a number of friends who are quantum physicists who are interested in levitation and are convinced after not only reading my book, there's other literature, but mine is the first focused study on the case of Joseph. But no, there's no question about it. I mean, I've heard many stories, such as the one you've just described, of people playing this game, sometimes children, sometimes adults. I had the same experience. I would swear that there was no physical pressure to account for that ex-Marine's elevation into space, just as you clearly saw and noticed that even when you took your hands off, it seemed like the movement was still taking place. The person was still in the air. And then, oddly enough, when he realized what was happening, that may have shocked him and put him in a different state of mind, and down he went. So I have to say that this is a mystery. And in my book, I do have a chapter on some possibilities, on some modern physical possible explanations, but they're just speculations. I could say something about one of these theories, if you're interested, very briefly.
Yes, please.
But yeah, well, one of the things that I noticed that I thought about when I thought about levitation and the case of Joseph levitating, all of the things that he would do in these states of levitation are things that might happen in a dream. In a dream, we can levitate. In a dream, fire doesn't burn us, as was the case of Joseph. He would go into a trance, and they would pick at him and sometimes stick things, and he would feel nothing. He wouldn't feel things. He wouldn't feel fire on his flesh. Gravity had no effect. But all these things are possible in a dream. Now, there are some physicists who are very interested in the idea of alternate or higher spaces. And so I speculated on the basis of reading some accounts of some physicists speculating on what might happen, not about levitation, but what might happen with these higher spaces. So the basic idea is that there may be certain circumstances in which dream space and waking space become compacted into one space. So, for example, in the case of St. Joseph, he never levitated. These things never happened unless he was in an extraordinary altered state of consciousness, a state that is invariably described as ecstasy, meaning he's out of himself. And so my speculation is that when someone is in an extreme state of ecstatic consciousness, something happens that enables dream space and waking space to come together around that person, in the vicinity of that person, so that that person is seen as if we're witnessing him in a dream world, even at the same time that we're in the waking world, which may sound bizarre, but it explains, it accounts for the phenomena. Whether or not that would stand up or there's any way to prove this, I don't know. But that's the only speculation that I was able to come up with.
Well, it's interesting because you're mentioning something, too, that we've referred to on the show in the past, the hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, the moments in between sleep and dream when people have experiences with ghosts, shadow people, alien abduction scenarios. It's that moment when the dream world and reality seem to blend together, and we're almost projecting or manifesting what was part of our last conscious memory from the dream into our realm. And to even dumb it down a little bit more, think about the end of Nightmare on Elm Street when Nancy sets all the alarms and says, I'm going to drag him out. She goes in, she grabs a hold of him, the alarms go off, and she pulls him from that dream state into reality. So it almost sounds, and I know that's a movie hook and cliche, but it sounds like that is kind of in the same realm, that when your mind is opened and you're in that hypnotic, that hypnopompic or hypnagogic state of trance, that you're kind of transcending the physical form, so maybe you're not following the rules and principles of physics as we know it here in reality. So that was what was allowing him to do these remarkable things. That was what allowed us to lift this boy with the tips of our fingers. And what allowed your students to lift a man in a seated position was it was kind of, even though it wasn't a deep meditative state, it was still kind of a hypnotic state that everyone was in, and everyone was focused. You did the deep breathing, you did the conscious effort, and the intention that was set behind it. So that, to me, is a very intriguing aspect of the entire story.
Well, that's an excellent suggestion, by the way, to bring in. I'm very interested in the hypnagogic phenomenon, and that would be an interesting way of describing this. But remember that what we're saying is that in this special state of consciousness, which could be induced in a group setting, it does result in new manifestations of physical reality, because, the gravity, which is a fundamental force of nature, is temporarily suspended. It is not, by the way, that, as some scientists would say, that the law of gravity is violated. Nothing is violated. It's just that something else is happening that makes, when I throw a baseball up in the air, I'm not violating gravity. I have a force that counteracts the tendency of that baseball to remain, on the ground or in my hand. So, however, this force that allows for the levitation is not a simple mechanical force. It's a mentally induced force. And that is something that is definitely a challenge to modern science.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I want to know so much more about St. Joseph. And how did his career start? Was this supernatural ability around him at all times? How did he find it? What was the catalyst for that? All right, it's time to dig deep into the realm of the Darkhives. We're going with a friend of ours, Jeff Belanger. You've heard him on the show for years. Well, he decided to come clean and share one of his tales. This is Theater of the Mind, alone in the dark underworld of the Paris catacombs.
I had been researching and writing about ghosts for more than 6 years before I actually saw one. It was September 16th, 2003. By that point, I'd interviewed hundreds of people about their own brush with the unexplained, and I usually, but not always, took the position, well, I believe that you believe. But when it happened to me the first time, I remember thinking, oh, this must be what they mean. Though I wasn't searching for ghosts per se, my first encounter happened in arguably the most likely of places. I was inside the Empire of the Dead, surrounded by 6 million human skeletons, deep within the bowels of Paris, France. Before we go too far here, let me set the stage for why this place exists. The city of Paris can trace its roots back more than 2,000 years to a time when this location was a Roman outpost. As more people arrived, they found an abundance of this great limestone they could use for construction. And build they did. An outpost gave rise to a village, which blossomed into a town, and as more people arrived, builders quarried more limestone to make foundations, halls, and homes. You see, back then, the limestone was easy to find. It sat right at the surface, so with some chiseling and hammering, the stones broke free. But over the centuries, that village grew into a city, a bustling hub of commerce, art, and culture. When you're building a city, you of course need a place to bury your dead. Often cemeteries are located at the outskirts of town, and that's just what Paris did. The only problem is that more centuries would pass, and that small city slowly grew into one of the largest in Europe. Building after building was constructed. They were getting larger and heavier, and that limestone wasn't so easily quarried anymore. Now they had to dig and tunnel under the city for more building materials. And those cemeteries? They had been approached, encroached, and now surrounded by the city of Paris. What once was rolling hills was now suburbs of the City of Lights. By the mid-18th century, Paris had problems, big ones. They had dug and chiseled almost 300 kilometers or 180 miles of tunnels with reckless abandon underneath the city. Those heavy buildings above were too much for some of the hollowed-out ground below, and under the strain, some buildings began to collapse. The second problem Paris faced had to do with its dead. There was no more room in many of these cemeteries, and corpses were literally piling up. You may be thinking, well, why not just start new cemeteries further outside of the city? Paris was planning new cemeteries, to be sure, but you need to understand that in this culture, it was critically important that your family members get buried with your ancestors. Clergy would take bribes to squeeze in one more body so a corpse could be interred with generations of his family members. The smell was putrid. People nearby these overflowing boneyards were getting ill, and finally, decaying corpses spilled into the streets. Paris decided they had to solve these two major problems. On April 4th, 1777, the Inspection Générale de Carrier was formed to reinforce, fill in, or close off sections of the tunnels deemed dangerous. It was also determined that the overflowing cemeteries had to be emptied. The bones would be brought down below into these tunnels. 30 generations of bodies and bones had to be relocated. Once the first bones were moved into these tunnels, they became the catacombs of Paris. A catacomb, by definition, is an underground cemetery. The work took almost a century to complete. Disturbing the resting place of the dead is a universal taboo, but Paris had no choice. The living will always prevail. As we fast forward back to September 16, 2003, I find myself standing outside the Denfert Rochereau metro stop. It's a bustling part of the city full of taxis, buses, and people moving to and fro. It's about 10:30 in the morning, and I can't find the entrance to the Catacomb Museum. If it's clearly marked, I'm missing it. I approach a woman walking by. "Pardon, parlez-vous anglais?" "I speak a little," she replies. I point to my map. "I'm trying to find the Catacombs Museum," I tell her. She looks puzzled for a moment. "Catacombs," I say again. Then she lights up. "Ah, catacomb!" "Oui," I say, "s'il vous plaît." She pulls me by the hand, and we walk just half a block around the corner to what looks like a storefront no more than 20 feet wide. A small sign in the window reads, "Musée de Catacombes." "Merci beaucoup," I say to the woman who is already on her way. I step inside, and the door shuts behind me. There are books and postcards around the small store. It's quiet. There's no background music playing, just the muffled noises of Paris outside. I approach the clerk behind the counter and hold up one finger. "Un ticket, s'il vous plaît?" I'm not sure of the French word for ticket, so I'm hoping the English version will be close enough. The older man behind the counter hardly notices me or my remedial French. He points to a sign that reads €8 for entrance. I hand him 10, and he gives me my change. He's obviously sized me up because he doesn't speak. With disinterest, he points his elderly finger toward a door in the corner. "Entree," a sign reads. I walk through and descend down a circular stone stairway. I'll find out later I'm heading down about 20 meters or 65 feet below the city. At the end of the stairs, I enter a cement room with many photographs on either side. These photos show times when the French underground used the tunnels during World War II. I glance around the sepia-toned pictures before moving on. Now, once outside of the cement room, I enter the tunnels. I'm the only person down here, and as bustling as Paris was above, it's eerily silent down here. As I walk, the sound of gravel crunching under my feet seems unnaturally loud. When I stop and listen closely, I can hear the drip, drip, drip of water as it seeps its way through the millions of tons of limestone above my head. If there's a collapse, there's no doubt this will be my tomb. I know what's supposed to be down here, but so far I'm not seeing it. There's lighting at shoulder level guiding me deeper into these tunnels. In certain parts, I need to duck slightly to pass. In other sections, the tunnel opens up to more of a chamber with a 20-foot ceiling. I'd been walking for maybe 5 minutes, though it seemed longer, when I come to a stone doorway with a sign in French above it. It reads, "Arrête, c'est ici l'Empire de la Mort." Stop. This is the Empire of the Dead. And stop I did. I'm guessing what I came for lies just beyond this portal. I take a deep breath, then step through. On the other side, the scene around me comes into focus like a camera slowly zooming in on its subject. There are bones, hundreds of them, thousands. Human skulls set in rows of bones stare at me with black, empty eyes. It's everywhere. I feel dizzy for a moment, but collect myself. I make my way through the dimly lit tunnel, being cautious to stay in the middle. I've brought a shoulder bag with me that contains an audio recorder for interviewing people, though that won't do me much good if my interview subject doesn't speak English. Plus, there's no one else down here anyway. And I have my camera. I start taking pictures. Though I don't think I can ever forget what I'm seeing, I want to be able to show others. I see stone signs that signify which cemetery this section of bones came from, and the dates when the bones were placed here, but there's no way to know who's who anymore. After snapping maybe a dozen pictures, I place my camera back in my shoulder bag and keep walking. The initial shock of seeing all these bones has worn off. I think about what it must have been like to move these people down here. How the designs, the rows of bones, some in shapes of crosses, others in Valentine hearts, others in arcs, are in a way beautiful. The only way these workers could show respect for the countless dead was to make the pattern both intricate and beautiful. The retaining walls of leg and arm bones set apart by rows of skulls. I peered closer. I dared myself to touch one of the skulls. I draw my finger close, then caress a skull, feeling its chalky, hard texture. I lingered only for a moment because I didn't want to seem disrespectful. My family heritage is French. Any one of these skulls may have belonged to one of my ancestors. Maybe even this one. I tried to imagine who this person was that I just touched. A man, a woman, rich, poor. I could see no picture of them in my mind. It's like everyone around me, 30 generations of Parisians, were forced into one collective voice. There were no individuals down here, just one group. As I continue my underground journey, I now turn my focus to getting out and returning to the surface. As I round a corner, I come to a long straightaway, a hallway lined with bones on both sides, easily 100 feet long. If I spread my arms out, my fingertips would have been touching bones on both sides. My foot slips just slightly on the loose stone below my feet. I regain my balance and look up, startled to see what appears to be a man. He's like a shadow, but darker, emerging from the right side of the tunnel about halfway down. I freeze in place. This man steps across the tunnel to the other side, then darts back to where he came from. My mind is whirling now. Is someone down here with me? No one came from behind. I cautiously move forward. There must be some side tunnel up ahead that I can't see yet. I close the distance by another 10 feet, 20 feet, but there is no side tunnel. As I stand right where this man stood moments before, I'm stunned. I'm left with only one word. Ghost. I think about the hundreds of people I had interviewed up to that point. Suddenly their experiences seemed all the more powerful. I wasn't asking for this to happen. It just did. As I make my way up the stairs at the far end of the tunnel, back to daylight, back to Paris, the experience is still sinking in. Near the exit, a security guard motions that he wants to search my shoulder bag. I hand the bag over as he ruffles through. I'm confused. Usually they check your bags before you enter a museum, not on the way out. Then it hits me. "You're looking for bones," I say. He points to the table behind him. There's a skull and 2 leg bones. It seems some people are still disturbing this place of the dead. "That's from this morning," he says in a deep French accent. I step back out into the light and noise of Paris. The experience of seeing my first ghost would continue to sink in over the course of days, weeks, and even months. Something changed in me down there. I'm now a person who has seen a ghost.
Beyond the darkness.
Welcome back to the show. This is the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. If you're listening to us through the Darkness Radio app, through the Google Play Store, please go rate that app and let us know about it. Tell us what you like, what you'd like changed. You can hit us up there, but make sure you go rate it so it gets spread and more people get to find out about it. If you're listening to us through iTunes, make sure you take just a few minutes to rate and review us on iTunes. That always goes a long way to help out. And I'm part of the Dark Zone. You can find that now on footprint.tv. It's a new web series, a mini web series called Is It Real? And you'll find it right under the Dark Zone banner on footprint.tv. We go in and we examine some of the most compelling pieces of paranormal activity. And along with some of the experts in the field, we'll break it down for you, take a look at it, speculate on what we might be looking at. In some cases, I think you'll join us in seeing just how easily we can all be fooled. And in other cases, there are some extremely compelling pieces. Episode 3, I suggest you check out right away at Waverly Hills Sanitarium. It took place at one of our Darkness radio events back in 2008. I was there. I was present. I saw this moment for myself, and it was amazing. So you can check that out at footprint.tv. It's The Dark Zone. Is It Real is the name of the webisode. So go check that out. Right now, we're talking with our guest, and this is fascinating to me. Michael Grasso, our guest. Wings of Ecstasy is the new book. The original book out there was The Man Who Could Fly, St. Joseph of Cupertino, and The Mystery of Levitation. Let's go back now into his history. Was this something that was a part of his world? Was he surrounded with strange supernatural type elements, or at what point did this manifest itself to him?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Actually, he was born at a period just when the scientific revolution was taking over, and his biographer is constantly reminding readers, he's saying, we realize, or I realize, as I narrate all of this, that this stuff is incredible, but we have lots of hard, eyewitness testimony. So, on the one hand, this is still a period where the supernatural is taken for granted, but it's also a period when the scientific revolution is beginning to affect the mentality of people in the church. So as far as Joseph is concerned, he starts off very early. First of all, his life is quite miserable from the very beginning. He was born literally in a stable. His father was on the lam from the police because of a debt that he had taken out on behalf of friends. He was a very genial fellow. His father's name was Felix, which means happy. But he got into trouble, and there was debtor prison, so he was not around when Joseph was born. Joseph's mother, abandoned also, was rather harsh, a person very moralistic. But the thing is, by the time Joseph was 8 years old, he already started to show signs of being distracted and dissociated. And so, for example, he would hear music in the distance, let's say, of a church, and his mouth would open. He would sort of go into a trance. And whenever people noticed him do that, they thought he was just stupid. And so he got the nickname when he was very young as boca aperta, meaning gaping mouth. And so if you read about Joseph, he's often, people who don't know anything about him, they say, oh, well, he was sort of mentally retarded. That's utter nonsense. He was not. But he was disposed to become enraptured or ecstatic. He had a genius for what I would call creative dissociation. And so he would listen to music, or he would say prayers, or he would look at the sky and be carried away. And, of course, at this stage of his life, he just had a vague spiritual inclinations, and he had a hard time, first of all, trying to get a job when he was quite young. He did poorly in school because he was so inclined to be distracted. And at one point he tried to get a job as to go in to become a shoemaker, and he was just too distracted, too incapable of performing that way. So he decided he'd try to get into a religious organization, and in his early efforts, he failed completely. He got involved with one group, and after 8 months, they got rid of him, and they discarded him as totally incompetent and unfit for becoming a priest, because there's a very intellectual part of becoming a priest. He didn't have a feel for that. He did everything that he was supposed to do in terms of spiritual training, humility, obedience, fasting. He did all of that stuff, but he wasn't particularly inclined to perform at the academic level. So it turns out that by chance, a series of coincidences, which I describe in the book, which seemed like miracles to him, and maybe they were, who knows, but it looked like coincidences. By means of several coincidences, he managed eventually to succeed in becoming a priest. one of the stories is just before he was about to be tested, and he really was ill prepared. The guy that was testing all of the others said, "Well, everyone has done so brilliantly so far. I think we can skip it for the rest." And so they all went through, as it were, including Joseph, and he became a priest. And at that point, his career launched. And at first, he was sort of noted for being absolutely severe in his asceticism. And I think this is an important thing to understand, to try to understand the psychology of how these paranormal phenomena are produced. The fasting, the constant prayer, the constant meditation, the self-deprivation. It's as though, Dave, the mystic or the yogi, because it's the same thing, the shaman, the saint, they're all operating on the same principle, I believe. What they need to do is break down the resistance of the ego and the body, which normally gets in the way of our ordinary consciousness. Most of us ordinary human beings are thinking about ourselves, our egos, our fears, our emotions, our appetites. But Joseph, once he took it seriously that he was going to become a friar, all he did was devote himself to his meditations, his litanies, his songs. He was very inventive. I call him, he was like a rap artist. He would make up his own little ditties that he would sing and get himself into a further state of receptivity. So gradually, in his early career, at first his superiors said to him, ease off with this ascetic practice. You're supposed to be ascetic, but don't torture yourself to death. And then he was very obedient, and he conformed to whatever the instructions were. And another interesting thing about his early career that I'll mention, which is fascinating, he had an amazing knack for reading minds. I mean, he not only was a levitator and a healer, he did all of the phenomena that we know about, prophecy and telepathy, clairvoyance, but he was so, let's say, good at reading people's minds that he would call people out publicly. He would say, you weren't praying just then. You were thinking about eating bananas for lunch or something like that, some silly little thing. And but it was annoying. So his superiors again intervened and said, Giuseppe, would you take it easy a little bit with calling out our peccadillos and noticing mentally all the things that we're doing? Just go easy on it. Be a little more discreet. Joseph became famous for his phenomena. That was, in a sense, the new phase of his life, that people began to visit him from all over Italy, and learned people, and eventually the Inquisition became aware of him, and the more he demonstrated unusual mystical and what we would call today paranormal abilities, the more he became suspect in the eyes of the Inquisition. The reason is that having these unusual powers and attracting people, there was a risk that he might deviate from church doctrine and start his own, heretical movement. This is a period during the Reformation when the church was struggling against the Protestant Reformation. So it was very important at that time that Joseph, that the good Catholics toe the line, you see. So there was an extra measure or degree of paranoia operating in the culture at that time. And so he was somewhat hounded for the rest of his life by the Inquisition.
Were they thinking that he was perhaps in league with the devil because he had some of these abilities?
That's an excellent question. And when he was twice hauled before the Inquisition, that was exactly what they would question him about. Not directly, but they would ask him questions like, when you do these things, do you feel proud about them? And so the point there was to see if he was getting too arrogant and too ego-oriented by the fact that he had these inabilities. But he answered impeccably. He understood what they were driving at, and he took it very passively and very obediently. Yeah, so Joseph then, as I said, gradually became quite famous, and people came to him from all over Europe and certainly from all over Italy, and he was observed and interviewed by popes. And one of the interesting stories is the Inquisition, which I had mentioned, who they were testing him and trying to make sure that he was doctrinally correct. Then they instructed him to say Mass in Rome, and some of the inquisitors went and witnessed him say Mass, and while he was saying Mass, he got carried away by some sound or something and levitated. And so the beautiful thing is you have the Inquisition investigating Joseph, not because they doubt that he levitated or did any of these things, but they witnessed him perform these phenomena, but their main concern was to make sure that his belief system was in order. And of course he succeeded in convincing them of that, because eventually, and it was a slow process, he was beatified and canonized as a saint.
That's fascinating that you said, like, when he was in the middle of these oral dissertations at the church, he'd be leading the sermon, he would kind of lose himself and then find himself levitating. I have had not levitation, but I've overwhelming social anxiety, and talking to large groups of people, talking one-on-one with people in person is very intimidating to me. Speaking in front of a large crew is horrific. But I noticed something very strange when I began doing the live events and public speaking with this radio show. I would have these moments where I would go up on stage. I would remember going up on stage, and then I would remember coming off stage drenched in sweat, and people telling, "My God, that was hilarious. That was one of the best talks I've ever heard. Wow, I learned so much." And I was like, man, who is running the ship? Because I have no memory of anything that just took place over the last 60 to 90 minutes. And I wasn't drinking. There was no drugs involved. So I wondered, was I just kind of hitting this kind of Zen level I was putting myself in to face this fear? And once I just kind of gave in and let it happen, do we just tap into that primordial part of us that has that ability? And if we don't fight it, we're not bucking it. And you know, that may be what was going on. His passion was so great that as he's talking about this, I mean, if you're God and you want people to believe that God exists, why wouldn't you choose somebody who, during the height of the passion of speaking the word of God and speaking the story, why not start to raise him on high? Literally, right? I mean, that seems like a pretty impressive way. I mean, once that started, did people start attending his sermons in droves to see the levitating priest?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they did. And of course, there's some interesting stories. On one occasion, several women, rather dignified, wealthy women, had come from another town, and they came up to him, and he immediately called them out because he was able to read their minds. He says, "You're just here because you're curious, not because you're pious." And he put them down and sort of scolded them. Not that he was cruel or anything, but yes, they did. They came and they were, and people were. The reactions are fascinating. People were frightened. They ran away in terror. They fell on their knees in awe and convinced absolutely that they were in the presence of divine power. It's fascinating to see the range of responses, the disorientation. But on the whole, though, this was a period when people believed that these things were real. But that doesn't change the fact that they reacted emotionally and in different ways. And there were some people who did suspect and wonder whether or not he was, in fact, in league with some dark powers. So the whole reaction there is rather complicated. Whereas today, the entire thing would be simply, is he faking it or is it real? And, you know, the scientific community tends to doubt these things. And I can tell you this from experience: I've had a lot of resistance on the part of people reacting to my book. Not that I've been critiqued. I've had 5 reviews. They've all been positive, and I'm waiting. I want to be attacked because the facts are so overwhelming. There are so many eyewitness reports, about 150 eyewitness sworn testimony over a period of 35 years, but hundreds, if not thousands, actually witnessed him. But 150 eyewitnesses spread over a period of 35 years from doctors, surgeons, all kinds of totally credible witnesses. There's no doubt whatsoever.
Right, and this wasn't the time where illusion, I mean, there's illusions, but to pull off illusions where he's able to fly around in these groups, if he was in these meditative trance-like states when he would do this, how dramatic was it? I mean, was he a few inches off the floor? Was he a foot off the floor? Was he 50 feet in the air? What was the consensus?
The highest that's a good question. The highest that I was able to discover was explicit 31 meters in the air.
What?
At Assisi, 31 meters. Have you ever been to Assisi by any chance? The church there?
No, I have not.
Okay. Well, I have, and there are these. There's a painting by Cimabue of the Virgin Mary, and you can see it's about 31 meters, way up on the side of the church. And the story is that when he first arrived at Assisi, he looked up at that statue, and it not that statue, the painting by Cimabue of the Virgin holding the child, and it reminded him of the painting of the Virgin and child in his hometown church, which is the first time that he levitated, was standing in front of the Madonna. And he looked up and he said, you followed me here, Mamma Mia. And he slipped into an ecstasy, and in front of numerous people rose, according to what I read, 31 metri, 31 meters. That's pretty high. And that's about as high as I recall the painting when I was at the cathedral at Assisi. So sometimes he would just hover a few inches while he was saying Mass, for example. Suddenly people would notice he's saying Mass, but he's about 3 or 4 inches off the ground, just floating. See? Other times he'd shoot up on top of a tree. There's a description of him like a bird, hovering on the branch of a tree, and then waking up from his ecstasy, and he starts to cry. He says, what am I doing here? They had to get a ladder to help him come down. He was unable to climb down, you see. And then one of the most spectacular stories, one of my favorite stories, was on a Christmas Eve. He was feeling very happy, wandering around town, and he bumped into some shepherds when they had their flutes and their drums. And he said, come to the church with me and let's sing some Christmas carols. So these shepherds came with their instruments, and they began to make music. And Joseph, of course, immediately got carried away, became ecstatic, and he flew halfway up to the ceiling in the church and began dancing in midair in front of these shepherds, who eventually wrote down exactly what they witnessed and completely blew their mind. I love that story because it shows that the ecstasy was a manifestation of divine happiness, of jubilance. And it's a little bit like, hey, do you ever wake up one morning when you feel in love with something or somebody and you're walking along and you feel like air, you could walk on air? Like we all have a little touch of that, right? Spirit rises in us. But when he did it, he literally sort of made gravity temporarily suspend its effect, and he did it in a sort of grand and totally shockingly amazing way.
I don't think he made gravity kind of yield to him. I think there was actually a transference of energy. I think that he transmogrified from a physical form to something light and ethereal. I believe that there's probably more to that because we know, I mean, science tells us, right, that we are energy. We are forms of energy down to the molecular structure of us. So if someone is so out of their own head, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but if somebody is so out of their own head and consciousness and awareness of the rules and regulations we're all supposed to follow on this world, and they're in this moment of pure and utter delight and bliss, it only makes sense that there would be this kind of change, this exaltation of energy that would kind of open. Has there been other religious leaders at any point that you were able to find that also had this ability? Or is that what makes St. Joseph so remarkable?
Well, what makes Joseph remarkable is the quantity of the evidence. But as a matter of fact, just in the Catholic Church alone, there are, according to the scholarly research that I have investigated, Father Thurston, for example, who is a Jesuit scholar, argues that there's at least about 200 saints in the calendar of the saints where there is reasonably good evidence for levitation. Joseph is spectacular in that the evidence is just massive and overwhelming. And also, it's not only within the Catholic Church. The best evidence comes from the Catholic Church, not because the Catholic saints are any better. I don't believe that. I believe all religions have these powers. But the thing about the Catholic Church, it's got this tradition of legalism that goes back to ancient Rome, so that the Church doesn't accept claims for miracles unless there are, at least certainly since the 17th century, unless there are clear eyewitness credible testimony, which is written down under conditions in which one has sworn that this is true. And but however, I've been reading lately about the Tibetan and Buddhist traditions. They are full of reports and artworks illustrating levitations and eyewitness cases in the Tibetan tradition. There is a lot of reports of levitation among mediums, shamans, and ordinary life, like the experience we talked about earlier that we've had ourselves. We've seen it. So why should not the yogis and saints and shamans of world history, no doubt, have probably excelled anything that, sort of have done these things in spades, as it were. And Joseph just appears to me, as far as I know, and my knowledge is finite, needless to say, he's just a star. I mean, in the sense that we have credible eyewitness testimony, but many other saints have been reported to do these things.
Now,
also,
I'm curious about, and I'm sorry, I'm horrible with the name. So it was Kim Jong-un, right, the original leader that passed away. When they talked about his biography, and I kid you not, there were ridiculous claims of he was born under a double rainbow and he could walk on water and every time he played pool, he could sink every ball with one shot. He hit so many 300s in bowling, and when he golfed, he would consistently get holes in one. So there is this press machine behind this, and people believe it. People over there believed that rhetoric. Do you believe there's any chance that stories like this, we need our leaders to look powerful and majestic and have these supernatural abilities because they're so close to God? Do you find any possibility in the writings that you come across that they could have been just propaganda?
Yeah, no, I don't think so, because the church the church is a very old institution, and it knows its enemies, and its enemies want to catch it in lies, and that's the reason why the Inquisition was so closely on the heels of Joseph, precisely because of that danger of mythical exaggeration. The church is much too smart to realize and that eventually they're going to be caught out, and they don't want lies and don't need lies. And if anything, they're extra careful about weeding out anything that's suspicious. And to the extent that today, when I tried to get a group of Catholic writers from, I won't even mention it's sort of a group of sort of intellectual Catholic writers, to get them to review my book and to get them to respond to the book that I had on, I had the most bizarre responses. I mean, they were very respectful and sounded interested, but in the final analysis, not one person was willing to handle my book about Joseph. I've got physicists and others, you see, and other religions and whatnot, are much more receptive. Although when I went to Italy last year, I went to Osimo, where St. Joseph spent the last 6 years of his life. I brought a copy of my book to the monks there, and they greeted me joyfully and accepted the book and me and all of that. But what I'm trying to say is that the church is extremely critical, and nowadays it's hard to get intellectual Catholics to admit that these things are real, because they're worried about science picking on them and attacking them as being retrograde and superstitious. Whereas, of course, in the 17th century there wasn't that concern, although it was beginning. The scientific revolution was causing doubts about these phenomena, and these doubts still exist. But and many of the criticisms, of course, are valid, and there have been exaggerations and fictions and lies and all of that, but not all. See, I mean, it's the whole challenge is to try to be totally objective and sift the falsehoods away and focus on the authentic stuff. And there's plenty there that is authentic, in my opinion. And it's a challenge to science, and even in some ways a challenge to religion today, because so many religious people are intimidated by science and tend to want to back away from their own traditions.
How ridiculous. Especially when you have a case this clear and astounding. Why wouldn't that be something? And especially in this day and age, Michael, where, let's face it, we need faith in something. We need to believe. And if you could talk about this ability, you know, I don't know, are we a jaded society now because we've heard stories of Noah and his extreme old age and building a giant ship that could hold animals 2 by 2 and you know, the entire world being wiped out by water? Are we just so overexposed to the phenomenon and phenomenal stories that have come through the Bible that we take very little stock in true miracles?
I think that's it exactly. And there's an impatience on the part of scientists. Stephen Hawking, whom I admire a great deal, a great physicist and a great human being, you know, with that physical problem that he has, his beautiful mind shines through it. Nevertheless, I recently read an opinion of his. He was talking about computers possibly becoming instruments through which we can become immortal, and I think that's utter rubbish. And then he referred to the belief of religious people in life after death as just fairy tales. Now, I'm afraid that's not true, because there's an enormous amount of compelling evidence that suggests, because I will be careful in how I will phrase it, that strongly suggests survival of bodily death. And this is not the product of religious belief, but the product of scientific investigation since at least 1882, with the rise of the English Society of Psychical Research. Scientists, philosophers, and physicists, they're a minority, Dave, a minority, but steadily, for well over 200 years, individuals have been collecting evidence that is, to some people, compelling, but certainly suggestive. Evidence for reincarnation, for apparitional phenomena. I myself spent a night once in a haunted house and was physically attacked by a ghost.
Whoa, hold on a second. We'll talk about that, Michael. Now you can't throw that out without me challenging you and wanting to hear that story. Speaking of the holidays, folks, Thanksgiving's coming up next week. Tim and I will be here for brand new episodes Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and a brand new True Crime Tuesday that you are not going to want to miss. But we are taking Thursday and Friday off to spend time with our family. For many of you, I've mentioned, and if you're just tuning in today, I'm getting married tomorrow. Talk about walking on air. I will be meeting and marrying the woman of my dreams tomorrow, and this is just going to be a great time. I can't wait to be in my life with her, and we're going to be doing this. And then next week, we're going to take off for the weekend and have a little family honeymoon up at the Palmer House Hotel in Sauk Center, Minnesota, where we'll be doing some ghost hunting and hanging out with great friends up there. So we will be off next Thursday and Friday, but returning the following week. But next week, you can get brand new episodes Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and a brand new True Crime Tuesday. But we will be off Thursday and Friday, just so you know that. Our guest, Michael Grasso, we're talking about the man who could fly. We're not quite done with that story. I want to wrap up with St. Joseph, and then you've got to tell us about your experience in the haunted house. But with the story that we've been covering and the man that could fly, tell me a little bit about what was his ending like. What was the end of his life and career? Did he go out in glory, or was he, shunned and forgotten?
No, he was not shunned and forgotten. And no, he right until the end of his life was both famous and kept under a kind of a house arrest. That sounds a bit harsh, but secluded. And he spent his time when people weren't trying to get at him in what he called his forest paradise, which was just simply a dark, solitary room. He was perfectly happy left alone by people. And it's very interesting, which I describe at length in my book on him, in the first book, and also in the second book. It's there. His death was fascinating. He was just joyful. I mean, it was a slow process. He levitated on the last couple of days of his life. He never lost this ability. I mean, even while he was ill and being operated on, he levitated. It's a very interesting story about that. And but then when it actually came to, it was clear that he was about to die. It took about a week or so. And I've never read an account of a more detailed description, because all of his the brother friars, you see, knew that he was dying, and every move and gesture was recorded. And he seems to have had the classic near-death or deathbed vision. He kept saying, "Oh, it's beautiful, it's beautiful." He kept seeing and describing what he was gradually coming to see as he was dying. And a couple of times he just jumped up and ran around ecstatically. Can you imagine someone on their deathbed suddenly getting the energy to jump up and run around joyfully saying, I'm about to die, I'm leaving? When someone said to him, well, why don't you pray and try to get yourself healed? He says, God forbid. He says, I want to go. I'm finally going to the place that I've been envisioning, and so forth. So his life, and then after he died, there were people came from all over because to be present at his funeral, or whatever you want to call it. And there was, as the Bernini writes in the biography, numerous accounts of unusual healings, especially. And in certain parts of Italy, there's still a persistent cult of Joseph. I met a woman who was from Joseph's hometown. I met her in Assisi, and she told me, she says, I owe St. Joseph all kinds of favors. I mean, in her experience, she felt a living connection with this saint. And I noticed that when I was in Italy, there were a lot of people who had that reaction. So, and then it took a while before he was finally canonized. And he has a persistent cult. And then there are some people, like psychical researchers like myself, that are aware of him as a special, highly special individual. And I'm hoping my two books about him will cultivate that awareness because he's such an enormously interesting person in his own right. The story is just an amazing story, but he's a challenge. It's a challenge to science. It's a challenge to our understanding of miracles. And it's certainly a challenge to psychology, because what is it about the state of ecstasy that it seems to permit so many unusual psychic phenomena? There seems to be a connection between those two things, the ecstatic state and the physical phenomena associated with what we call parapsychology. So his career is not over. I mean, and I've got physicists interested in thinking about him today, and I hope that. And there's a great deal more. Since I've been in Italy, I've collected even documents that I haven't even written about, more stories, more details, and so I hope that the interest in this man continues and grows.
Do you find articles and papers written at the time from other religious scholars that would debunk or at least attempt to debunk what was going on? And what was the common belief?
Yeah, the common view of nobody, including non-Catholics, who look even at the records in English, and they're feeble compared to the material. Because I've read all the stuff in all the original documents in Italian. But I have never come across anybody who tries to dismiss or argue against the reality. There's just simply too much evidence there. There's nothing there that you can use to explain away. I mean, you can, for example, a medium in a dark room is said to levitate. Okay, the skeptic can say the room was dark, their expectation was there, it only lasted a few seconds, and so on and so forth. You can raise questions like that about many of the claimed levitations of the mediums of, let's say, the Victorian era. But you can't do that with Joseph. The only way you can dismiss Joseph is to dismiss 35 years of historical evidence. If you do that, you can have doubts about anything. And it leads you to I think, a completely unsupportable attitude toward history itself. And so, anyway, that's how I would summarize my view of Joseph.
What a fascinating story and an amazing man. This is something I'm going to want to read a lot more into, and I know we just connected in the last day here. I'm going to be getting the book so that I can read this and follow this story. But I want to make sure people realize you've also got another brand new book that you're working on, a new program. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? I'm going to try to hopefully have you on Coast to Coast with me to discuss that book sometime in December. But what have you got?
No, this is the book, the Final Choice, is what you're referring to, right?
Yes, yes, it is.
Not the second book on Joseph. Yeah. Well, that's the funny story of that book is that was my first book that I published in 1986. It's called The Final Choice, and I had a different subtitle. And I wrote that book when I was discovering the near-death experience, doing survival research on survival, but also under the shadow of you will remember back in the mid-'80s, a lot of anxiety about a nuclear war.
Right.
And there was this sense that I had that the thesis of the book was roughly that as we are challenged on a global scale, is it possible that as we approach these terrible sort of global challenges, that there might be something like a global near-death experience, just as an individual who approaches death, is near death, suddenly has these breakthroughs and these marvelous experiences that have been studied since at least 1975. Is there some analogy there that we can perhaps talk about increasing crises, increasing the likelihood of spiritual transformation? Well, that was a book I wrote 32 years ago and forgot about it. And one day I got a letter from an English publisher, White Crow Books. They publish books. They publish classics, really.
Right, yeah, we've had authors on that are part of White Crow.
Okay.
Right.
And so I didn't understand when I was invited to republish that. I said, well, I wrote that book 32 years. I've learned a lot. I'll do it, but you have to let me rewrite it and update it. And John Beecher, the excellent editor there, said, of course, you can do whatever you want. Took me, and so what I realized, and what I thought that I was being asked to republish this book, because the situation in the world today has become, in the past year or so, as anxiety-producing, if not more so, today than it was in the mid-1980s. There's a lot of talk nowadays about the growing threat of nuclear war, but in addition, we have the threat of climate change. And so it took me 6 months to rewrite the book. It's essentially the same book, and so I use some of the same material, but I try to update it. And what it does, basically, it's a call for a new mythology of transcendence, and it focuses on the theme. By transcendence, I mean something. We all know how that word can mean something. We transcend a problem. We transcend our neurosis, our fears, and so on. I use the term specifically to describe the possibility of paranormal transcendence of physical reality, including the most striking and important phenomenon of survival of bodily death. So, and as I say, at that time, I was becoming acquainted for the first time with the near-death experience. So what the book does is explore different ways in which we can enlarge our conception of human potential, and it's a kind of an attempt to provide raw material for a new mythology, a story about human potential and the human capacity to transcend not only life, death itself, but to transcend in this life, to become different and more complete human beings. And I try to connect the need for that with the growing menace in the world. We're facing challenges that, as far as I can see, and I hate to sound too pessimistic about this, but there are trends at work in the world today, the nuclear trend, the climate change, the huge inequities or inequality of wealth all over the world, which are creating increasing challenges and tensions. So that the world is becoming more frightening and disturbing, but everybody talks about it nowadays. And so with that background, I'm saying that I'm trying to suggest in my book that there are resources available to human beings that may come into play as we delve more deeply into the challenges of the future. So that's the gist of the book, and it's hopefully an optimistic account of what we're capable of what kinds of changes we are latently able or potentially capable of. And the suggestion is that maybe as things get really bad, we may be surprised by the liberation and the opening up of ourselves in the challenges to come. So it's kind of an optimistic and pessimistic book at the same time. And,
very cool. And we'll be visiting with that again, possibly on Coast to Coast or on our show again. And now, as we're wrapping up for the evening, I know you've been kind enough to stay a little longer with me than expected. Can you tell us about your experience? You went to a haunted location. Can you tell us where that was?
Sure. I'd be happy to, because it's one of the most interesting experiences I've had a lot of interesting experiences.
Okay.
But this one, I spent the night in a haunted house, okay? I knew the woman who reported to me, and she told me that about 9 different people, including herself and her children, had witnessed this entity in the house. It was, and I called it a dirty ghost because it liked to appear when the girls were taking showers. And I had given them the picture of Padre Pio and she told me that she put that picture at somewhere above the reach of her 3 children at the time, and it disappeared, vanished. She never was able to find it. Well, anyway, after hearing these stories and hearing all the different visits or the different encounters with something in that house, I was invited to spend the night there. So I did. And I was sitting downstairs in the living room, and I was told where this entity often appeared, or the presence often appeared. So I didn't really expect much to happen, and I was sitting late-ish at night, totally alert, reading in a couch, and I suddenly, what happened, it must have been about 1 o'clock in the morning, I heard a gong ring, and I looked around the room I was sitting, and I noticed that there was a gong with a stick attached to it hanging on the wall. But there was nobody in the room that caused the gong. So I got up, pulled the stick out, and hit the thing, and that was produced the exact sound that I had just heard. At that moment, the woman in the house came down the stairway and asked what was the gong ringing for. And I said, well, and I explained what had happened, and she looked at me and she said, oh, like, that's probably him. And so she went back upstairs and like, okay, big deal. We've seen stuff like that before. For me, it was overwhelming because I know there was nobody in that room. Now, but me, I was the only person, and I know that I didn't go up and ring the bell. And I knew it was the same sound when I actually did ring it. So I thought to myself, I lay back and I thought, wow, terrific. I spent the night and I got a nice little piece of evidence that there's something going on that's strange here. And I thought that was it. So I leaned back and I'm sort of reading, jotting down notes of what had just happened. Then I suddenly looked up into that very corner where I was told this entity often appeared. And lo and behold, I see a fluttering, transparent form of a man gazing at me. And I look up at it, and the minute I look up at it, it advances rapidly toward me and wraps itself around me. And I'm paralyzed, and I'm lying there, and I'm trying to shout out, "It's here." Those are the words I wanted to say, but I couldn't say it because I was completely paralyzed by this entity that was facing me. I can't say that it was like a blurry thing that was wrapped itself around me. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm absolutely terrified and at the same time jubilant. I'm saying to myself, I have evidence. I'm seeing this myself. And I'm crapping in my pants at the same time. Pardon me. So this then just released itself from me. And, of course, there was no sound in this process. And I was tempted to yell up to the guest that let me stay in her house, say, hey, I just had this encounter, but I didn't have the nerve to do that. And I just lay there and wrote up what I experienced and finally fell asleep and reported in the morning. So that was an unquestionably, unambiguously clear experience. I mean, I know the skeptic could say, oh, you were dozing and you were dreaming and you were... No way. I know what happened to me. I have a very clear sense of my own reality, and I'm not easily talked out of what I know I've experienced. I have no doubt about the reality of this. I don't know what it was. It certainly looked like an entity, a ghost, something unreal, not unreal, but surreal or physically unusual. And so that was one of the most powerful encounters. So anyone who says to me, do you believe in ghosts? I say, I sure do. I know I've been attacked by one physically. So I've had other experiences that I could go on, at least 2 or 3 vivid, powerful, and compelling experiences with ghosts. And so it's hard for me to deny. Oh, I have to admit this. I'm so skeptical in my nature, so trained by the scientific worldview, that despite this experience, which I've just recounted, all the reading I've done, and other encounters, at least 2 other encounters with ghosts, there's still a little element of me that doubts that maybe these are just real phenomena, but sort of illusions that coughed up from my own unconscious. So I that's just
I feel
where
you.
I am mentally.
I feel you, Michael. I'm in the same situation. I've had so many experiences, but then I sit there dissecting my own experiences and trying to almost devalue them. And sometimes it's, like you said, sometimes it's just good to accept it for what it is. And like with the story of St. Joseph, there's no real way to to discount the amount of things that were happening, and there's no real answer for it. And maybe we don't need an answer. Maybe it is what it is. This was a remarkable moment in time.
There are things that are real that we don't understand. I mean, we don't understand why we're conscious. That's one of the greatest mysteries of science. Nobody, even the most severe reductive materialist, will admit that they cannot explain this mysterious, intangible thing. Think about what it is to be conscious. I mean, your thoughts, they're not visible. Your feelings, your will, all of the stuff that's going inside of you is real. It's not the brain. It's related to the brain. It's not the brain. It's mental. And we're facing a mystery in our own. Every time you wake up in the morning and you're conscious, the sun shines through your room and you behold the sun. To me, it's a miracle. We don't understand why we're conscious. And so from that level on to all the other stories, the kind of stuff that both you and I have encountered and are fascinated by, when you add it all up, the world is an infinitely more interesting, complicated, mysterious, and beautiful, strange, and sometimes very terrifying place than the mainstream, scientists with their materialism want to admit. It's an unfortunate thing because the mainstream is very reluctant to admit the very things that we are discussing right now. But I do know that there's a minority of people like us out there studying this stuff, writing about it, and one of these days I think it's going to break open the mainstream point of view and reach a larger public. But I think radio programs like yours are a big help. But still, there's this massive resistance in the culture, and I'm sure you've noticed that, right?
I do. I mean, there's a shift. There's definitely something going on.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, let's get together and do a little stiff as a board, light as a feather, and we'll experience this ourselves. But maybe that levitation, we all need to just start cueing in to ourselves and getting ourselves, that's the whole point. Listen, on all of these shows we've had, folks, across 12 years, it all comes down to, you want alien contact? We've got to be in a better mindset. We've got to be in a better frame of caring, loving, kindness. You want more experiences with the other side. You want ghosts to make themselves known to you. It's when you're in the higher levels that you start to be open to these situations. When it comes to UFOs, aliens, Bigfoot, it always seems to come back to loving what you're doing in the moment when these experiences open. So maybe levitation is the next evolution for us, and it's always been there, but we're so weighted down by our own egos and idiosyncrasies and anger and rage and pettiness and jealousy that we're keeping ourselves from achieving true levels of miracles that would be a part of our life. And once we've been able to achieve it, it's no longer a miracle. It's just something that has been innate in all of us. So maybe start to look at that part of your lives. And you got the holidays coming up. You've got Thanksgiving, you've got Hanukkah, you've got Christmas, you've got Kwanzaa, you've got time with families. And instead of focusing on the stress of these moments, let your soul fly and enjoy these moments and be in the moment. Put down your stupid devices and just enjoy the moment, like Saint Joseph did. He was in the moment, enraptured with the moment, and it lifted him, not just in spirit, but in physical form. So just think about that. What if? What if?
Yeah, beautifully said, David, beautifully.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Hey, guys, you got a long weekend ahead of you. Go check out footprint.tv. The Dark Zone is there. The new mini webisodes, Is It Real? There's 3 episodes up you can go see right now. They're all between, I think, about 5 to 12 minutes long. Go check them out. We'll be adding more episodes as we go along. And if you've got really cool, perfect evidence, something that you've captured yourself that you'd like us to analyze, email me, dave@darknessradio.com, with the video links, the photographs, and audio evidence, and we may use it on a future episode. That's it for this week. Be safe, be kind, love one another. Thank you all for the kind thoughts and the prayers and the light you've been sending our way. And tomorrow, when I marry my best friend, we will be thinking of all the love that you've given to us, and we'll be hopefully returning it back to the universe tomorrow. So be kind, and we'll be back with you again next week in a shortened week with the best of Paranormal Talk Radio here on Beyond the Darkness.